Hello, my name is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the director of the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone here at the center and at the university, I'd like to welcome you to the OU Iranian Studies podcast. We're recording this in September of 2019, and I'm pleased that the podcast is now in its second year. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to our other podcast episodes, they're online. Please go to the Farzaneh Center website and you can listen to them there. We also have a video library of talks that people have given among our visiting speakers. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, so please like us on those things. Today, for the podcast, for this episode, we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Nahid Siamdoust. Nahid is the Ehsan Yashater Fellow at Yale University's Iranian Studies program. So, Nahid, welcome to the OU Iranian Studies podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Afshin.
Good. I'm glad you're here. Thank you. We've been trying to bring you for a couple of years, so
I'm glad I finally made
it. Welcome to the southern plains of the North American continent.
That's right.
So, well, thanks. Nahid is the author of Soundtrack of the Revolution, Music and Politics in Iran, published in 2017 by Stanford University Press, a book that has received a great deal of well-deserved praise. There's a lot I'd like to talk to you about relating to the book. I'm also hoping to maybe have some more general discussion about the state of the field in Iranian studies and those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Maybe the best place to start, maybe you can say something about your academic training and your background generally, if you'd like to start with that.
Sure. So I'll start sort of at the beginning. I did a degree in political science and art history initially, and a master in international affairs, and then went back to Iran, back as in I hadn't lived there since I'd been 10 years old. But I then went to Iran and worked there as a journalist for several years, really from about 2002 through to 2009, though I had several longer stints in other places, and worked across the Middle East as a journalist. And then started doing my PhD at Oxford in 2007, though I was sort of doing it remotely for the first couple of years, and then returned and worked there with Walter Armbrust, who's an anthropologist of Egypt, and a media anthropologist, really, sort of culture and media anthropologist, and was trained by him in anthropology and the methods and literature of anthropology, especially Middle East anthropology. And from there, finished my doctorate there in modern Middle Eastern studies. And really, my book came out of the dissertation that I wrote.
I remember, I was a graduate student at UCLA in history in the 90s. Ancient history now, I guess. But I remember when the Walter Armbrust book came out.
Right.
Mass Culture Modernism in Egypt. And I think it was mid-90s.
Mid-90s, yep.
And, as a historian, that book actually had a big influence on how I thought about history, because there wasn't really much serious discussion of media studies and mass culture and pop culture as the evolution of that within the context of the Middle East. And that book, actually, I think, even though it was written by an anthropologist, really taught a lot of us historians how to do cultural history. And there wasn't really much of that, and I think really even until recently with your book, Soundtrack of the Revolution, and a few other things, there seems to be a kind of an emergence of something that Walter Armbrust and a few other people had started in those days. I mean, the other book is Hami Nafisi's work from the 90s, which was the other book about a lot of these things.
Film and media, yeah.
Yeah, and even the book on mass, Iranian television in Los Angeles. I don't know if you've seen it.
Right. Yeah, really just taking media as an important and significant register of study. That's something that Walter Armbrust did with his, taking mass media and examining its role in the processes of modernity in Egypt. And only a few years ago, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, Walter published another article really arguing that we should be giving more emphasis to the study of media in all kinds of processes. But that's been his life's work.
That's good. I'm glad to see there's more. That stuff has become really almost mainstream now. So there's a lot of people doing
That's
that.
right.
And so it's had a big influence. I mean, and we see it in your book too, Soundtrack of the Revolution. I guess the primary focus of your book, as far as if I can sort of define it, is to look at the political evolution of Iran since 1979 by analyzing music and the cultural history of music and the politics of music.
That's right.
So, what do you think, looking at the politics of music in Iran during that period, what does it teach us about the Islamic Republic?
Well, what it really teaches us is that the Islamic Republic, as a state, has had various trajectories of decision making and policy making. And one really important concept within Islamic Republic policy making has been the concept of maslahat, or expediency, something that Khomeini himself, toward the later years of his life, sort of late 80s, in a series of very open and public jurisprudential meetings clarified, which basically meant that the interest of the state trump the Sharia. So what is in the interest of the state, of the continuity of the Islamic Republic, is more important than a strict allegiance or following of the Sharia. And
I mean, so there's been a kind of evolution.
Exactly. There's been and that has allowed for all kinds of flexibilities. So what determines what kind of policy is set in any area is not some sort of obscure weighing of the various jurisprudential reasonings of the various ulama or marajih taqlid, sources of emulation, who can really disagree among one another. But what really trumps is what is in the interest of the survival of the state, and that has led to flexibility in policy setting in the cultural realm, when it comes to music, when it comes to film, and in other areas as well.
But I mean, the early period, though, I mean, I guess it would be the 80s if we kind of define it in stages. There was a more strict policy in terms of regulating music, and then there's other stages in which it has, this maslahat process has kind of come to moderate, as the journalistic language. But those are the stages, right? Basically.
Yeah, I think Khomeini himself arrived at this idea of maslahat, I believe, through having reigned as a pragmatic statesman, as opposed to just an ayatollah for several years. And there was a real turning point only about a year after the revolution happened, after he had said, eliminate music completely. I mean, he has a very categorical statement on music. He says, eliminate music completely. It corrupts the youth. It, just get rid of it. And then a year into the, about 9 months or less, September of 1979, Murtaza Motahhari, one of his dearest protégés, is assassinated. And about a year after that, people within the field of music who are affiliated with state media, they produced this piece in commemoration of Motahhari that includes instrumental passages that are reminiscent of the songs of someone like Haydn, so the classical pop music of the pre-revolutionary era, very rhythmical, and in fact, based in the Persian Radif. And all of that music was thought to be completely out of question after the revolution. And so these people create this song, and in order to test the waters, take it to Khomeini himself. He listens to it, asks to see the makers, and says, I do not cry much, but I cried when I heard your song. This is the most beautiful piece of music that I've ever heard. And if you continue making music like this, I will support you. So from that point onward, already about...
So that's pretty early, actually.
A little more than a year into the revolution, rhythmical music is green-lighted by the revolutionary father, Ayatollah Khomeini himself. And as of then, producers within state media start to create music. So the issue was no longer, is it too rhythmical? Is it too fast? The issue was one of commitment. Is it committed to the ideals of the revolution? And if it's committed to the ideals of the revolution, then it is within the interests of the state. It accords sort of to maslahat, a policy that he later articulated.
I mean, but ultimately, this is another theme that really comes through in your book, is that the state itself really does have a kind of commanding role in defining and shaping and regulating, the official understanding of, in this case, music. And they're pretty robust in regulating music, despite whatever maslahat there might be. In some ways, thinking about sort of the other areas within the field of Iranian studies. I mean, I work on nation building and the cultural history of nationalism, mostly in the Reza Shah period, and it kind of reminds me of the cultural policy of nation building in the Reza Shah period, and
Right.
the way the culture was defined and shaped, and kind of the state was the agent of a lot of those things. Do you see the book being in conversation with the sort of larger debate about national identity and how it's made and remade in 20th century Iran and beyond?
Absolutely. And, what's interesting is that there are continuities, but there are also a lot of discontinuities. So in the Reza Shah period, what you see is that he really just rejects, traditional Persian culture. He has no love lost for Persian classical music. He brings in foreign European
right. And you write about
musicians,
that. Yeah.
right, to teach Iranians how to play Western orchestra music and
right.
march music, and eliminates, for a period of decades, there really isn't much support for Persian classical music. Of course, musicians continue to make their own music, but on the stage, on the state stage, right, what you see sort of promoted, that's not part of it.
I mean, one of the maybe the shorthand misinterpretations of the Islamic Republic is that when 1979 happened, it was a kind of retreat from modernity, or there was the pre-79 period was sort of the modernization period, and 79 and after was a kind of resistance to that. But one theme that really comes through your book is the continuity in this kind of modern, even the Islamic Republic uses modern techniques of governmentality or the state project. And that is, I think, something we need to understand, is what some of these continuities are, despite the discontinuities that are also kind of... maybe another theme that comes up is this theme of poetry. Maybe we can say something about that, because that's obviously a big theme in your book. And poetry is obviously such a big part of Iranian culture. A figure like Mohammad Reza Shajarian, for example, he really becomes a kind of, more than just a musician, really a kind of moral authority.
Yeah.
How does that work, do you think?
So I just want to tell you, before I sort of go back to answering that question, that Mohammad Reza Shajarian also saw himself within that role. So when I talked to him about, his role as a musician, he said, the role of musicians is to guide the people. That is their role. And I said, well, is that sort of, would you say that's a similar role to that of, let's say, clerics and ayatollahs who believe that they're there to guide the people? And he said, yes, absolutely. We do it too, but we do it more beautifully. We do it with music.
That's great.
So he very much sees himself within that role of guiding the people. And poetry plays a really large role in Iranian culture, of course, and in the music of the past 100 years, because and going back to the conversation about the state trying to police the cultural arena, and this being a very sort of modern phenomenon of trying to really regulate what kind of art is produced and is not and is in the public realm, the art of Persian classical poetry to be able to express things not in an implicit way, right? Where in the poetry of Hafez and Rumi and Khayyam, certain meanings are conveyed without the explicit terminology that would get those poets or those who trade in that poetry, listen to that poetry, into trouble. And Shajarian uses some of that poetry. So, for example, the poetry of the era of the constitutional period, and he's actually working, he's sort of continuing the tradition of Arif Ghazvini, who at the time of the Constitutional Revolution for the very first time used Persian poetry to politicize, the musical concert. So the musical concert at the early in the 20th century became this arena, one of the few spaces where strangers could come together in a public setting and have a political conversation. And Shajarian takes a lot of the songs from that early period, and his Morgh Sahar, for example, is from the early 1920s, written by Malik Shuara Bahar. It was written in critique of the Reza Shah period, actually. But he takes that, which turns the Golo Bulbul around. The nightingale and the rose is politicized. And so by doing that, he's also drawing on a tradition that's been going on for over a century in Iran. So this freedom discourse that Shajarian creates in his work is not just a discourse that he's created in post-revolutionary Iran that points to that very moment. It has much more depth and significance because it points to this century-long arc of freedom-seeking activities in Iran. And so when people in his concerts repeat the refrain, "Ey Khuda, ey Falak, ey Tabiat, turn our day around, oh God, oh universe, oh nature, let us have our day, let the, caged bird break free." It is in that long tradition and hence much more significant still.
Yeah, and it's part of this, this debate about who speaks for Iranian culture. And there are these different spokespersons from different parts of Iranian society, and the clerisy are one, but poets and musicians, and even in some ways filmmakers have come to play that kind of role. So I think that's one of the themes that really does come up in the book. Another big part of the story that you tell is really a history of technology and music. Everything from the beginning, record players and cassette tapes and, VHS and DVD, and of course satellites and YouTubes and blogs. What are some of the implications of these technological changes? How does that kind of factor into how music becomes part of the politics of modern Iran?
Understanding technology and technological evolution is central to understanding not just music, but political mediation in modern Iran. And, you see at the time of the revolution that the cassette tape, small media, as Annabelle Sreberny and Mohammadi have written about, small media are instrumental to mediating discontent during the revolution. And if you look at the musical sphere, if it wasn't for the music, for the cassette tape, these musicians who continued throughout the 80s to produce music that they couldn't really sell in stores, and because music was still problematic in the 80s, they were able to trade these, small pieces of technology under the table in certain shops, or even as Mohammad Reza Lotfi, one of the most famous tar players and practitioners of Persian classical music, who passed away several years ago. He told me, he would stand in Imam Hussein Square and literally pass out his cassette tape. So without that, it wouldn't have been possible. The biggest sort of game changers in post-revolutionary Iran, as far as technology is concerned, are of course the VHS tape. And this is something that I'm currently working on in the 1980s. How, in the absence of the internet, in the absence of satellite television, in the absence of free channels to exchange opinions and culture products, the VHS tape was this world that allowed a window onto the world outside, but also created this space for people to trade in political and social and cultural discourses that they couldn't officially. So the VHS tape was probably one of the, was one of the biggest game changers. And then, of course, satellite television. Once satellite television technology in the late 90s, more like maybe mid-90s, right, becomes prevalent in Iran, and even up to today, Iranians are no longer bound to the state and what it allows. Iranians are plugging into all kinds of programming that is beamed in from abroad, and then the internet changes everything, of course, right? You no longer have musicians were no longer dependent on the state to get permits. They could easily upload their music on the internet, and social media as a next step of the internet, of something
Right.
that people easily have on their phones and sort of engage in on a daily, if not sort of almost hourly basis, afforded a whole other dimension that has opened these spaces for mediation.
I mean, I think that's obviously very true, and you have a very detailed discussion of that in the book. But what you also discuss in the book is, on the one hand, technology becomes a way of being subversive because you can use technology to do the things that you're describing. But what you also describe in the book is really the role of the government in kind of regulating these things. And what was really interesting and I guess impressive is how the Islamic Republic is actually quite savvy in its use of technology to police the culture in some ways. It's sort of this cat and mouse game. But technology can work both ways, right?
That's
Both as
right, yeah.
subversion and authoritarianism.
That's right.
So how does it work? In this sort of more policing kind of
Yeah,
way?
and I think you see that much more with the internet era. So with the technology that I discussed before, cassette tapes and VHS tape and so on, satellite television even, that wasn't something that the state could police at large. That was too difficult to do. And at some point, the Islamic Republic gave up policing satellite dishes and trying to take those on. And now everybody has them, and nobody really has to fear for some members of the police to come and take down their satellite dishes. The internet is a whole other issue, because the internet allows for the state to do deep monitoring of people's activities. And in fact, after 2009, the state instituted FATA, which is the internet police in Iran. And they really have everybody's they have a very large bureau that is dedicated to following people's digital fingerprints, especially following viral videos and being on top of who's producing what and who's out there, and being able to really track those people down. So when the group of kids who did the happy video of Pharrell Williams, did their version of Pharrell Williams' Happy Dance, they were tracked down within a matter of a day,
That's
right?
interesting. Yeah,
Within a matter of a day or so after sort of the video went viral.
Right.
And within a matter of a week or so, those kids were on state television
Right.
saying they'd done wrong.
So yeah, definitely, I think you're right. In the area of some types of technology are easier to regulate,
Yes.
and so that's part of this process. Well, I mean, speaking of the policing, you do describe in the book this sort of maze or this web of bureaucracy that regulates musical culture. Maybe you can describe some of those things. What are they, like the Ershad and other things? How does that work?
Sure. Yeah, there are three main offices that regulate music. One is the music office at the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, Ershad. The other one is Seda Sima. So state television and radio has its own set of operations, and they're not beholden to permits from Ershad. And the other one is a much smaller one. It's the Hose, which is linked to the Organization for the Propagation of Islamic propagation. And they are actually the most closely linked to the Office of the Supreme Leader, but they're a small organization with a lot of money. And their operations and the kinds of music they've put out actually works out in counterintuitive ways. So Mohsen Namju's first album was produced by the Hose, right? By this organ that is supposed to be the most revolutionary. The Hose came about because a number of very revolutionary artists said we need to have our own institution to create the most revolutionarily committed culture production. And but because of the proximity that they have to this culture, to this political power, they're actually able to be more flexible and do things that a place like Ershad, for example, which is linked to the government, a ministry that is on the cabinet of the president, can't really allow itself to do.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, one of the things we always hear about the politics of the Islamic Republic, another one of our journalistic cliches is there are hardliners and there are moderates. And of course, everything is always much more complicated than that. And it seems like part of what you're describing is kind of that complexity. Some
Yes.
institutions have a stricter policy, and others have more pragmatic policies. But that's part of the confusion because
Right.
nobody ever knows what the actual rule is. or-
Believe me, musicians are so confused, and this hasn't changed. I mean, it's the same story from about in the 2000s when I was reporting, and then in the late 2000s and onward when I was doing research for my dissertation. The phrase you constantly keep hearing is "taklifa musiri roshan nist." Music is in limbo, and I think those policies of ambiguity are in some ways intentional. For example, a group like Oham, one of the very first rock groups to come of age in Iran, to really create a fan base. This is in 2000, right? In 2001, they had this concert at the Orthodox Church, which was de facto the first underground rock music in Tehran. It was semi-public because you could purchase a ticket. You had to kind of know about it, but you could purchase a ticket, and because it was in the space of a minority, right, the Orthodox Church, they could allow for something like that to take place. They tried for more than 10 years to get a permit. They only had a presence online. More than 10 years to get a permit. Never got one until about 2014 or so. And I happened to be in Tehran at the time and attended their concert. This is, after this music group, this band had existed for 15 years or so, finally they had a concert. And the people who showed up had brought their kids along. I mean, it had been so long that the fans who, had been keeping sort of faithful to this group had now children and were bringing their kids to this. But after that, after those couple of concerts, again, their permit was withdrawn. And Shahram Sherbaf, the lead singer of Oham, wrote this very public letter to the Ministry of Culture saying, I don't know what to tell you. I'm a musician. My only source of income is music. And on this day and age, I have to tell you that I'm broke and totally depressed, and I'm sick and tired of your policy of come back tomorrow. And I think this policy of come back tomorrow, keeping people in limbo, has served, the Iranian officialdom because they can be quite arbitrary. I think I've mentioned elsewhere that this policy of ambiguity in some ways has also been utilized by cultural producers for their own creative ways of pushing the envelope, right? Using the ambiguities that exist to do things that are not explicitly forbidden, for example.
We see that in film too. It works
right,
the same way.
exactly.
Nafisi has written about that.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it works the same way in music.
That's interesting. Yeah. So it's one of the dynamic natures, the dynamic quality of all of this that is still kind of unresolved, but probably that's inherent to the politics of the Islamic Republic. One other theme that really jumps out in your book that I think is also a theme that the larger field of Iranian studies is engaging with is the transnational element and the role of the world outside of Iran and how that shapes the politics and the culture inside of Iran. And in your case, you talk about, the expatriate cultures, the expatriate communities of Iranians outside of Iran, in particular Los Angeles, the Los Angeles-y style, I think of Tehrangeles, my hometown, my, shout out to my homies in Tehrangeles. But how has the Islamic Republic managed these kind of transnational connections? Is it a culture that threatens the politics inside Iran? Are they threatened by it? Do they manage it? Do they make use of it? How does it work?
I would say as far as Los Angeles-y music and so on is concerned, yes, they did initially feel threatened by it. That is no longer the case since pop music has been greenlighted. And since then, if you look at, expat media programs, they try, especially at times of heightened political tension in Iran, they really try to intercept those programs and, Parazit, Parazit Mifrasan, they tried to cut those programs by putting parasites, I don't even know how to say that in English, into the air, so that people can't receive that kind of programming. So in post-2009, it was nearly impossible to watch BBC Persian, for example. And now, of course, they're really they don't like Iran International and other stations that beam this programming, this anti-Islamic, or I mean, BBC Persian is not even necessarily anti-Islamic Republic. It's just,
Right.
critical content. But I want to go back to the point that you made about, okay, so what happens, because something I do argue in my book is that I think that if it wasn't for the continuation of this expatriate music scene in Los Angeles, in Tehrangeles, right? That perhaps pop music in Iran would have never been greenlighted. Because what happens when you look at the micro processes of how pop music, and this is a process I describe in my book, actually happened, is that there was an official, Ali Ma'alem Damghani, who became the director of music at state television, and he had real political capital. He was a close ally of Khamenei's. He's a poet. Khamenei famously likes poetry and has these poetry evenings, right? So Ali Ma'alem Damghani was an artist, a poet, and was a close confidant of Ali Khamenei. And after many years, there was a bottom-up pressure by young musicians who wanted to create pop music internally, right? And one of the musicians who was at the forefront of doing this, Khashayar Etemadi, had a voice that had very clear similarities to the voice of Daryush, the beloved Daryush of pre-revolutionary Iran, who is now in Los Angeles, right? Who at the time in Pahlavi era Iran actually was a political singer and had been imprisoned because of his work by the Shah's government. So this guy, Khashayar Etemadi, keeps sort of bringing tracks to the directors of music at state television before Ali Muallem is there, and they all say, no, your voice sounds too similar to a Khanande Umar Abi, to this guy that we don't want to, promote here inside the Islamic Republic. But then Ali Muallem comes in, and this also goes back to your question about continuities as opposed to discontinuities pre and post revolution, right? He comes in and he listens to Khashayar Etemadi and he says, wow, well, your voice sounds great. It just sounds just like Daryush, right? And because Daryush had been a political singer, he actually likes him. And in the interview with me, Ali Muallem kept mixing the two up, right? So he would say, didn't Khashayar Etemadi sing Bouye Gandom, which is a famous song of Daryush? And then I said, look, isn't it problematic that this guy has a voice that is so similar to, this Khanande Umar Abi as he was accused of previously? And Ali Muallem's response was, no, it's not problematic. That is their cultural heritage. All rivers flow into the ocean. It doesn't work the other way around. Just because he's in Los Angeles doesn't mean he's not part of our cultural heritage. This is from one of the closest confidants of Ali Khamenei, right? But he's now sitting in this place of power. And he says, this is great. Let's do it. And so it's really there that pop music becomes greenlighted. But of course, the element that you mentioned before, the threat, also plays a factor. Because there's this rumor, which I couldn't really fully confirm, but it was around that what happened subsequently was Khamenei sought the opinions of Maraj Taqlid across Iran, in order to stop the flow of this illicit content that's coming in from LA. Is it okay for us to allow for the creation of state-sanctioned, state-approved pop music?
Right.
And he gets their consent. And then Ali Muallem says, well, perfect, because we have this guy who is a continuity of the kind of singer that we like, which is politically committed.
And that I found that whole discussion in the book really fascinating. The sort of local Iran-produced alternative pop music that was that grew out of this interplay between the expat community and the politics inside Iran. So I think that's really interesting to think about how the world outside of Iran and the expatriate communities still have a place inside Iran as well, in sometimes surprising ways.
Right.
Another theme that comes up in your book is this generational theme. And you do seem to describe these musical generations that have evolved since 1979. And I don't know how many of them you can define. I think you have this sort of Nasl Savom idea of 3 generations or so. But certainly a very important person in that generational evolution is Mohsen Namju. And so how would you kind of situate him? What does he represent in terms of the generational evolution of the politics of music in Iran.
So I bring the notion and concept of the generation into discussion with Mohsen Namjoos, especially because he is a child of the revolution. He came of age during the revolution, so he remembers the war. When he was coming of age and he was a teenager, he was at the receiving end of some of the most draconian sort of measures of moral policing in the public realm, right? It was a time, this is something that he's written about in his Dahe Shast, which is a sort of declamation. It's a poetry that he often sings along to his sitar, in which he says, having long hair was a crime, wearing short sleeves was, deserved you a kick in the groin, and so on. What was allowed was this yared cherk, having sort of dirt around on your collar and just appearing to, having the 3-day beard, and that was the that was the ideal that was promoted by that was a sign of faith, right? As opposed to being clean shaven and having a Western tie and so on. And so I argue that because of having been at the receiving end all of this, the kind of music that he produces is very it's very angry, and it really wants to break all those molds. It's very critical. He has a song in which he depicts the country's supreme leader Ali Khamenei in the worst sort of possible language you could imagine, and he really lashes out against everything that the Islamic Republic stands for. And I bring this into comparison with the generation that comes after him, after this Nasl Suchte, the burnt generation, which is called burnt because they basically lost their youth to these, to the moral policing of the Islamic Republic, is the generation that comes after him of kids who are Dahe Shasti, late Shasti, sort of born after the war. They're born after the war, and their consciousness is a completely different one from Mohsen Namjoos, because they're coming of age at a time when 9/11 has happened, the U.S. has attacked Afghanistan, has invaded Iraq, and now there's the threat of an invasion of Iran every day sort of on the horizon, right? This was something that Iranians really talked about in the 2000s, and so the rappers that come of age in that time really are writing against this kind of global power imbalance and the kinds of injustices that come with that, the kind of injustices, so Yas, for example, writes about the children who are killed in Iraq. They need milk and diapers. They don't need bombs. And, and Hichkas presents his posse as one that's going to defend Iran, although it is still actually subversive, and he presents his posse as one that is going to be defending the honor of Iran, sort of setting a parallel between his honorable posse versus the Basijis, the Iranian officialdom, who's no longer capable of holding up that flag. But still, it's this global consciousness of where Iran stands in the world, and a lot of really patriotic and nationalistic themes come through. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, in the context of rap music in particular, I think that's one of the big discussions in the book as well. Iranian rap music seems to have really taken on a whole different kind of life of its own that's extremely popular. And you say there's some unique qualities of rap music that kind of makes it naturally kind of, adaptable to the Iranian context.
I mean, for one thing, rap is basically poetry, right? So it's something that is that Iranians are at home with. And, there is something like rap in Persian culture. It's Bahr Tawil, it's a kind of long sort of expression, sort of long poetry that isn't exactly set to a very traditional rhyme. And so when talking to these rappers, they would all tell me, well, I started writing poetry, and then I heard rap music coming in from, my father brought me a tape from Germany, my uncle brought me a tape from the US, and I heard this and I was blown away. I thought, I can do this and I can set this to music. And the other quality of rap, of course, is that, and this is something that Hichkas, for example, Surush Lashkari, the rapper, told me, is that he was like, I don't like bazi. I don't like, I don't want to dance. I want to express my thoughts. And the only medium that really allows me to do that and present my life at this sort of, is rap music, because I can express a lot within a short
It's a kind of social
amount of
critique,
time.
rap.
Exactly.
And that's how it plays out in a lot of
Sure.
contexts.
In the West,
in
yeah.
the West as
well, and certainly its origins, and it still
Absolutely.
continues to, yeah.
Absolutely. That's interesting. Just to stay on, I guess it's rap music is the music of Yas.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that really jumped out at me is your discussion of his song "Hoviyataman," which does have all of this nationalism themes of nationalism that comes up in some of his lyrics. But it's surprising to me that so much of it actually references a kind of pre-Islamic nostalgia, which, for those of us who have sort of made careers of deconstructing the history of Iranian nationalism and the sort of neoclassicism fetish that defined all those decades of the middle part of the 20th century, it was surprising for me to see that, there's this rapper who was born in the Islamic Republic and reared during the utopian, decades of the Islamic Republic, actually reviving this revival of using that as a basis for rap music. So where does that come from? What does it say about, I guess, the historiography that critiques neoclassicism and Iranian nationalism? I don't know. What do you make of Yas?
Well, I get Yas because he is completely the norm. So whatever historiography, your very valuable historiography that you yourself have done and others like you have done, is not something that Yas and his generation are engaging with. If anything, they are doing.
It's a good thing, good for them.
They're promoting the exact opposite, and sort of exhibiting allegiance to this pre-Islamic Iran, to having symbols of Zoroastrianism like Ahura Mazda and so on as jewelry or on your T-shirt and so on, is so mainstream among Iranian, I would say not just even youth, among Iranians today. And this discourse of, if only it wasn't for Islam, we'd be such a better country. It's baffling because you've had 40 years of an Islamic Republic whose main goal and aim has been to Islamize Iranians and to have this sort of perfect Islamic polity, right? And this is a conversation that's going on in Iran itself as well, by the way, which is, it actually all of that enforcing has turned people away from religion, and they're locating the source of their problems in Islam now, and they're kind of ugly sort of nationalistic tones to it too, like very anti-Arab, very sort of pro-Aryan, and so
I think we need to continue to have this dialogue so we can kind of work through some of the problematic elements of this. Hopefully they can listen to our podcast.
If only it was in Persian, right?
Well, maybe one final question, and this might be, I think, where your book culminates is with the 2009 Green Movement. And you have some very interesting connections that you make between the politics of the Green Movement in 2009 and the role that music played in that movement. Can you say something about that? How did music sort of play a role in 2009?
Music played a big role, and but what was really most fascinating was that a lot of the songs, the role that music played in 2009 was to emphasize and reiterate that the goals of the 1979 revolution had not been met, because there was a lot of recycling of the songs of 1979 going on, and many of those songs in turn hailed from the constitutional revolution. So all of a sudden you had this narrative that spanned 100 years or more, and really made all of that music and discourse all the more powerful, because it was like Iranians had been at it for more than 100 years trying to achieve this freedom and justice and this country that they were working toward. So it was interesting on that, really fascinating to watch. There were many different versions of Morgh Sahar, for example, including by Mohsen Namju, for example. But another interesting aspect of it was that Hossein Mousavi's own campaign, youth campaign, chose a former Marxist song as their campaign song. So Hossein Mousavi had chosen Aftab Karan, which belonged to the Fedayeen, chose the song that in some ways signaled that, let the bygone be bygone, right? Let's forget our animosities of enmities of pre-revolutionary Iran, these divisions between leftists and Islamists and whatnot, and let's have a more inclusive discourse about the future of Iran. And I was sitting in the stadium when his song was first broadcast, and I was sitting next to a woman who was in her 30s, and there was instant tears. I mean, as soon as this song started airing, there were instant tears because, within a few seconds of listening to the songs, and this is where the power of music comes in, she had received that message, right? It wasn't necessary to have a very explicit sort of political statement or anything. In fact, that would have been problematic, but it was possible to choose this song. And then, also what happened during 2009 was that songs like Yar Dabistani Man, A Iran, these very sort of national, A Iran is a sort of
anthem.
De facto Iranian, national anthem. It never actually was Iran's anthem, but it is de facto sort of Iran's anthem. And Yar Dabistani Man is about sort of this thing that unites Iranians, right? They all at one point were in primary school. They all were once children of this country, trying to make this place a better place. And so these very nationalistic, sort of patriotic songs pointed to a secular future, right? People weren't using a lot of Islamic signifiers in the music that was used. That was, Islam had played a big role in the songs and the music of 1979, but it was basically not present in 2009. And that was another interesting thing to watch.
I think you also describe, it did have this sort of unifying quality across different social divisions. I mean, and that's sort of one of the questions that always comes up in discussions of 2009 is sort of the, the social composition of the 2009 movement. Did it represent a kind of a middle class frustration with Iranian politics, or did it represent something more broad-based than that? And I think in the way you describe the role of music is it had this socially unifying quality that did cut across different social divides.
I think so. I think it's you could certainly sort of a bit harder to see. I think the cross-class aspect of it is a bit harder to see perhaps in music, although, Yar Dabistani Man is a song that's intoned in all kinds of student gatherings, and students are certainly cross-class. We're not just talking about middle class. And you also the intonations of Allahu Akbar, which again was juxtaposing the Allahu Akbar of 2009 to 1979. We're still calling to God, right? That is an instance of authority that is separate from the authority of the Islamic Republic. So in that sense of people going to their rooftops, which happened across,
right.
But having been present in the 2009 demonstrations, just based on my experience, I mean, I was observing mechanics from the south of Tehran march along with, bank tellers from, central to south Tehran, to, old ladies who were living right around the Azadi area, which is, again, certainly not a, maybe lower middle class. But I do think that the Green Movement was, in its embodiment in the streets and the protests, a very wide cross-class phenomenon.
And I think in the book you describe how music kind of helped to unify and build these connections.
That's right. I mean, all you needed to do was to say, intone a line from Morgh Sahar, or intone a line from Shajarian's song Tufangit Ro Zamin Begzar, or intone a line from Hamid Anik Pei's song, for which he took the poem from the demonstrations, actually, in which people sort of turned Ahmadinejad's speech about the Chasuchoshok around and said, you are the Chasuchoshok. I am the Nur Manam Hole. I'm the halo. I'm the light. Anyway, so with one, it was very easy to sort of unite with somebody else based on just a simple line.
And music and poetry can do that.
Right.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've still only scratched the surface in both the subject matter and what you discuss in the book. Congratulations on the book. I certainly look forward to reading more of your work as it evolves in the future. And thanks again for making the trip to Oklahoma. Really appreciate it, and for joining us on the OU Iranian Studies podcast. And thanks to all of you.
I just want to say thank you so much for having me. Your work is inspiring, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Thank you.